at St. George's College in Jerusalem called The Holy Land in Depth. And it was a visit to Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Turkey. And following all of that Middle East trampling about, it seemed logical to go somewhere and process it all. And I can't imagine a better place to go and think about things than in England. So I was very privileged to have been offered a residency at Christ Cathedral in Canterbury for a little over a month. And I stayed there, and they put together an itinerary for me to meet various members of the staff and various members of the diocese and learn about what was going on in the Church of England in Kent in 2000. And I'm not going to share a lot about that with you, but I think we have some interesting history and some pictures to look at involving the cathedral. And then I came home on one of my life dreams, which you'll hear about when we get there. So here is Canterbury Cathedral as it was in the year 2000. You probably, very good. I'm sure many of you have been there, and these hopefully will bring back some memories for you. Canterbury is located to the southeast of London. I know that this slide is probably a little difficult. We're going to be challenged a little bit today on our slides, and I just advanced it. To the next slide, which is a picture of the town of Canterbury. And the cathedral is here. The cathedral is here, and it's what is called the Cathedral Precincts. It's where it's located, and there is various schools and the main artery to shopping located here. And when you drive along, we have those wonderful roundabouts where you get lost or don't get lost. When you pull into the street that Canterbury is located on, you see the old gateway. And many cathedrals in England, not all, but many, are what they call a close or a precinct. And it's a gated community of homes, offices, shops that are related to the cathedral. I mean, workshops, not commercial shops necessarily. And then the center of it all is the cathedral. Canterbury Cathedral is large enough to have its own precinct's police force, and the cathedral vergers are connected electronically, Bill will be interested to know this, with the precinct police, and the police's jurisdiction stops at the door of the cathedral, so the vergers have to be trained with certain police duties to deal with things as that happens. A close-up of the gate. This gate was completely sort of sacked at one point, and so the statues you're looking at here are a reproduction. There's your site of the cathedral. First thing you see when you walk through the gate is the magnificent cathedral, Christ Cathedral, home of the Anglican Communion, and we're going to learn a lot more about that in a few minutes. I talked about a precinct. Tell a little bit more about that. The arrow is pointing at the gate. You just walk through. And of course, this then, here was your vista here, where I took the slide. The precinct exists and is blocked off by homes, shops, and houses, and you can't get through them except when you go through one of two gates. So the buildings have like these firewalls where you just can't, if you're on a building that's up against the precinct on one side, doesn't mean you can open a door in your cathedral. You've got to, you don't find, there's no door there. You're in a building, but you've got to go outside and through the precinct gate. And that's how you enter the cathedral. And the gate I showed you is where the red arrow is, and there's another gate over here. And those are the only two ways to gain access to the precinct. So it's a very secure place to be. These are the towers on the outside of the precinct with the statue of Christ on the other side. If you walked in the door and you stood here, that's where the photograph would have been taken that I just took. And here, you see this little apartment building here? That was my home for 5 weeks. It was absolutely wonderful, all to myself. I had my own kitchen, my own washer-dryer, and a living room, a dining room, the whole thing. And as an American friend of Canterbury, I got that entire privilege for £8 a night. These are the towers. The west tower, the northwest tower is called the Arundel Tower, and the northeast tower is called the Oxford Tower. One contains the great clock, and the other contains an automated carillon, which rings a series of bells on the hour, quarter hour, half hour, as well as times that call the faithful to worship. They're a relatively smaller set of bells. The cathedral has over 20 bells total, and this is the smaller of the carillon. I can't tell you how amazing it is to be in the precinct and have your day just marked by the ringing of change ringing. That you know that 15 minutes before service there's going to be a peal of bells that are going to remind you the service will begin in 15 minutes. And services take place constantly in the cathedral. So the bells are going off all the time, and you just develop this rhythm over a few weeks. You really get into it, of knowing when they're going to start, and you anticipate them. And it's not to say I didn't get out to London and get out to some of the castles and royal palaces. I did that too. But a lot of the time I was tired. I had just spent all this time in the Middle East. So I was writing, I was reflecting, I was taking notes, I was trying to absorb the life of the cathedral. Yes?
You mentioned all the different services. Is that like morning prayer and matins and the whole 9 yards, or they were all Eucharist during the day?
No, there were morning prayer services. The evensong, of course, every afternoon was a big one. There are over 12 chapels in the cathedral, which would see special Eucharists go on for various occasions and various events. Typically the bells were programmed, though, only to go off when it was one of the more major services. And we'll see in a few minutes how that translates into the Lantern Tower, for instance. This is the central tower called the Bell Harry Tower, and it holds some of the 20 bells. The largest bell is at 3 tons. We'll see inside that tower, looking up into it in a moment. And I mentioned to you that the Lantern Tower is what indicates a special event of some kind. If we're commemorating a saint, or it's the presentation of our Lord in the temple, there's something special going on. The lights of the Lantern Tower are lit. And I was there in November. So by the time you got around into the evening, it was very obvious that this special tower was lit. And the scaffolding, they were restoring it. And the scaffolding came down about halfway through my time there. It was really nice to see all of the hard work that they put in to the cathedral. The cathedral has shops, workshops for masonry and for stained glass and for archives. And at any given moment, there are numerous employees devoted to conserving books. At any given moment, a portion of the cathedral masonry is always under restoration. And at any given moment, except one day out of the year, the cathedral stained glass, there's a window missing because it's being conserved. Because by the time they do all of the windows of the cathedral, it's time to take the first one out again. But they stop it for one day and have a celebration of the glass in the cathedral in its completeness. Excuse me?
When was the building built?
The building built,
Yeah.
we are going to get to that. Maybe I did miss that as we go on. It was founded in 597. The current building is much more recent. It was consecrated in 1070. And there was a great fire in 1174, which resulted in considerable renovation. So the stained glass, the oldest parts of the cathedral are only 12th century, and I think the oldest stained glass may be only 13th century. So, relative newcomer on the scene. All right. Here is a map of the cathedral, and we're going to take a little walking tour through the cathedral. It's going to be a daylight walking tour. I did have the privilege of having one of the canons there as a spiritual director while I was in residence, and he was retiring at the end of the month, and he gave the last of his candlelight tours of the church. And it was just a stunning experience. It was a 2-hour tour in the evening after dinner, and you're each given a candle, and then it only has certain lights on. And he'd been giving this tour for 25 years plus, and so he knew just where to have certain subtle lights on and other lights off. And very powerful to walk through the cathedral, particularly the crypt during this period. So this is the outline of the cathedral, and I remember the shape of the cathedral, just as kind of a memory, in that it's the same shape as the Nomad probe in the Star Trek episode Space Seed, which we see here. Cathedral, it's not the largest cathedral in Europe. It's not the most beautiful. It's rather gangly. It has a lot of buildings attached to it over the years. If you notice, it's not even exactly symmetrical when it gets to the front. But it nevertheless is the most important of the sites for the Anglican Communion. And that's what makes it a place of pilgrimage and of worship and of remembering all of the things that took place there. So if we come in through the two towers at the west end of the church and look into the nave, this is what we're going to see. And you'll see cathedral chairs are the black sort of boxes there at the bottom are chairs that go all the way forward. And then as you get to the front, there's an altar. And this is like the National Cathedral in Washington. You can't see the high altar, so they've moved an altar out and built a platform, and they've put an altar on it so that there's an altar in the nave. Because the altar is being separated by what's called the rood screen. So this is the altar. Can you see the two candlesticks? Yes. And here's the frontal. This is the pulpit we're going to see in a few moments. This is the rood screen. Originally, the rood screen was to keep the general public away from the most holy areas. The choir is going to be up in here, called the Great Choir. I spelled it with a Q, the Canterbury. It's the largest cathedral choir in the world. And that is, I guess, the statistic Canterbury does hold. And it's because Canterbury was also a monastery, in addition to being a cathedral. And the monks liked to sing. So they built this enormous choir for them to sing in. And it's extremely impressive, the Great Choir. And when the monasteries were dissolved in England by Henry VIII, what saved Canterbury from being destroyed was the fact it was a cathedral. But what gives Canterbury its name for greatness as a building is the fact that it was a monastery, which gave it its choir. So it's kind of this catch-22 situation. We're going to see what happens when you're a monastery and not a cathedral outside of the cathedral when we look at St. Augustine's Abbey, which is quite close by. In front of the altar is the seal of the Anglican Communion set in the floor in brass. It's quite large, as you can imagine. They redid the floor of the nave at some point in the last maybe 50 years, and they discovered underneath it the ruins of St. Augustine's first church, which actually began at the foot of the pulpit steps, the current cathedral. And so in commemoration of that discovery, they installed the seal of the Anglican Communion in the floor of the church. And the motto is, "The truth shall set you free." Another interesting statistic about this is if you go to the National Cathedral in Washington, you'll see a smaller version of that same brass seal set in the floor as a gift from Canterbury Cathedral at the foot of the cathedral, which is the bishop's throne for the presiding bishop of the United States. So it's replicated there. Okay, we're going forward further into Nomad, the probe from Star Trek. And we're turning around and now we're looking west. And as we look west, this is our shot. Above the altar, there are a series of steps that go into what's called the crossing. And the crossing is underneath the great tower, the Bell Harry Tower, just before you go into the rood screen. And you're going to tell me, you're going to say, well, I thought Canterbury Cathedral may have had more. I could swear when I worshipped there that I was sitting in a transept, and that transept was not looking into this area. Well, Canterbury Cathedral is so large and gangly, as I said, it has multiple transepts. So it's the only church I've been in that does have multiple transepts. So some transepts are here, there are more to come. We're looking down from the rood screen. And you can imagine how large the cathedral is, even though it's not the largest cathedral in the world. As you, above you on the rood screen, there is room to put the London Symphony. Here is the pulpit of the cathedral, which we saw over on the left earlier. And during my tour from the head verger of the cathedral, one of the stories he liked to tell was that earlier in the year, the Archbishop of Canterbury had given an annual address that's always live by the BBC. And there had been an incident where a protester had feigned an asthma attack. And so vergers rushed to their aid. Well, this is all on live television. Well, someone jumps into the pulpit and gives a scathing rebuke of the Church of England's position on gay and lesbian rights. And the Archbishop just sort of stepped back and let that happen. And you've got the mayor of the city and the chief of police in the front row. The chief of police and his assistant both having left their radios at the door because the vergers are in charge of communications and security in the cathedral. And the vergers had dropped everything to get first aid and try to seek a doctor in the building. And so the chief of police actually had to run out of the building to a constable standing outside the cathedral who was radioed, and they had to allow special security forces in to secure the people. So the whole thing took like 4 or 5 minutes. And he was going on and on about it. I mean, clearly this was something that, was a really big deal for him, and it all happened, on live television. I don't remember hearing about it. But if any of you do have great memory from the year 1999, I think it would have been Christmas of 1999, let me know. At the steps of the pulpit are 2 very large carved figures. One is Augustine of Canterbury, seen here, and the other one is Gregory the Great, the Pope that sent Augustine to Christianize the Angles and the Saxons, who really didn't need Christianizing, thank you very much, because they member of the Latter-day Christian. Okay, now we are in the transept, the first transept. You can see another transept coming up. This transept is looking directly upward into the vaulting, the fan vaulting of the Bell Harry Tower. And you will see the cross of Canterbury there, which is a blue cross, or a blue background and a white cross in the blue background. And the seal of Canterbury has this symbol in it because of the gift of a palm, a white palm from the Pope to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we'll learn more about what a palm is in a little while. A palm isn't exactly in the shape of a cross, but they sort of adapted this shape for the seal that they wanted in the vaulting. So now we're going to go forward and we're going to stand near one of the other transepts, and we're looking forward. And as you see from this shot, there's a very ornate throne. And the nickname for this throne is called the wedding cake. And the Archbishop of Canterbury has two thrones, one of which he sits in when he is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the other he sits in when he is the primate or the head of the Anglican Church throughout the Anglican communion in the world. This is the throne he uses when he is the Archbishop of Canterbury, just the Archbishop of Canterbury. Some people ask, well, who's this person in a sarcophagi buried, and entombed in the foreground? Is that St. Augustine? No, it's not St. Augustine. I'll show you a picture of where St. Augustine is buried in a little while.
Who is it?
I don't know. There are a lot of people there. A lot of people buried there. As I mentioned, the largest choir in the world is at Canterbury, and this, I'm standing at the edge of the choir looking east toward the high altar, and behind me is the choir. Ahead of me is some overflow seating for congregations. And they have one of those wonderful great brass eagles that show up every so often in English churches. And there's the high altar. It was Advent. It is very grand. And if you notice, interestingly enough, the red carpet doesn't stop at the altar. Can you see where it continues behind the altar? It goes up more steps. If you kind of look at the brass spacers on the steps of the altar, or on the steps of the carpet, you see these gold pieces that are holding the carpet down. Now look behind the altar and you'll see more of them continuing up another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 steps higher. What could be higher than the altar at Canterbury Cathedral?
The verger's office.
Do you know the verger's office is actually under the high altar? There's a special little door that you open up, and you go down these steps, and he has a whole little suite down there, an office and a little library, and all these things are under the high altar. It's fascinating, and he has a prayer desk. We have here the prayer desks in front of the head verger has a prayer desk, but the top of his prayer desk flips up, and there's a map of the cathedral inside the prayer desk, and he has control over audio, visual, and lighting from buttons inside the prayer desk, and then he flips it back down and puts his prayer book back. And he's not the principal person to control these things. There are technicians that control them, but his prayer desk overrides them if there's a problem and he wants to make a change. So what could be over the high altar? What possibly could look down on the high altar?
The Archbishop's primate throne?
Exactly right. The throne of St. Augustine. And this is it. You can see it. You see the outline. Well, sorry. Back. My little red marker dot is so close to the button that makes the slides advance, it's hard for me to make a difference. There it is, there's the throne. And if we look forward a little bit, there it is. Now, the throne of Augustine. It's not the chair Augustine sat in. The original chair was destroyed by fire in 1174. And so this is a 12th century chair, probably built in 1200. To replace it, and it contains, though, they think, fragments of the original chair. And that big blank space that you saw around the chair used to house the shrine of Thomas Becket, one of the most famous martyrs in all of England, and certainly the famous martyr of Canterbury. And that shrine was destroyed, removed, and confiscated by Henry VIII. Now we're going to keep walking further and further to the very top of the cathedral. The far eastern spot is the Corona Chapel. And Corona means to us what? The head, crown. It was created to hold the top part of the skull of Thomas Becket when he was martyred. The first blow skimmed off the top of his forehead and brain. And this chapel was created to hold that relic. And it's the Corona Chapel. And it today is dedicated to all martyrs of faith. And there is a worshiper lighting a candle at the Corona Chapel. The head verger told me, tourists really like lighting candles. We try to keep on top of this. Try not to run out of candles. You really like lighting your candles. Canterbury's most famous martyr has to have been Thomas Becket, known as Saint Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas of London, and later Thomas à Becket. He was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1162 until his murder in 1170. A great friend of Henry II, Becket was made Archbishop rather unexpectedly. He was not a particularly pious person, and the king put him in that position in order to better keep track of what was going on in the Church of England. And surprisingly enough, Becket made a tremendous pious conversion and suddenly became his own person and a patron of the poor, the needy, and the mission of the Christian Church. He is venerated by both the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion. What happened was, one evening, Henry said those famous words, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And 3 knights set out and entered the cathedral through this door, which is the entrance to what is called the martyrdom, the place where Becket died, where he was murdered while celebrating Mass. It was one of the most witnessed assassinations in history, as it was done in full sight of the congregation. And on a heroic note, one of the altar servers came to the Archbishop's aid with the processional cross, and the young man was struck down and murdered for that attempt. Today there is, at the site of the martyrdom, a relatively modern shrine. It's very dramatic, showing the 3 blades of the swords of the knights that came in, and the largest one pointing down to a small stone altar which marks the spot. One of the notes, particularly gruesome notes of history that I will add in for interest today, is that Becket was found to be wearing not only one, but two hair shirts under his vestments. The first hair shirt, designed to cause discomfort and to remind you of the frailty and sinful nature of humanity at the time, even as you're dressed in your great finery, to be very uncomfortable underneath. The first hair shirt had grown into his skin, so he had worn a second one. And for those people who may have questioned exactly how sincere Becket's pious conversion was, the idea that he would so subject himself to the hair shirt ritual is a sign for many that it actually was incredibly sincere. And they didn't want to touch his body at first, and so the body grew cold, and they knew that Becket was truly dead when the maggots that lived in the hair shirt left the cold body in search of something warmer. This is all described in the famous play Murder in the Cathedral, which was written in, let me see, my notes here. The author, Thomas Stearns Eliot, was born in 1888 and died in 1965. And somewhere in there, this amazing Murder in the Cathedral was written, which I had the privilege of actually being a part of at one point when I was younger. And Eliot has been called one of the 20th century's major poets. And I just have to throw this in, that this is a modern sign on the door because of the many doors at Canterbury. The wind can create wind pockets, so you have to keep certain doors closed all the time. And this was the door very close to the martyrdom, and I think it could have been the outside door where the knights came through. And I put it up here with great irony, the sign saying, "Please shut the door." What if the door had been shut and locked way back when? Would have history been different? Who knows? The shrine became the site of pilgrimage for many, many people across Europe, and you would approach the shrine on your knees. And these are the stairs leading up to the shrine, and you can see how they're worn down in the middle, and that wear are from the knees of countless pilgrims coming forward. The Canterbury Cross, which we acknowledge today, and we have depicted around many churches, including this one, the Canterbury Cross was originally a Saxon brooch, which was discovered in 1932 in Canterbury, in Kent, and it was dated about 850, and some people would have worn this brooch as a sign of reverence and veneration. It may have been a token of pilgrimage at some era later on, but it does predate the martyrdom, and there were specific other tokens of pilgrimage that were given if you made that long trek to Canterbury. Main tower, Bell Harry Tower. View from the close. The close is the part of the church where the monks would go to think and to talk with one another, and it typically went around a courtyard on four sides. This is looking through onto the chapter house, which was where the monks would go to listen to scripture and to be taught and to receive whatever information they needed about their common life that day. We've now walked inside the chapter house and are looking out, and this particular stained glass window is showing here in this panel the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. Here is the penance, the whipping that Henry II was subjected to for allowing that to take place. And here is a scene of veneration and people coming to pay their respects to Thomas Becket. Spectacular stained glass in the chapter house, and even more spectacular fan vaulting in the ceiling. Imagine the intricacy and the level of detail here. And I'll just give you a quick shot, close-up, and just see how amazing that detail is. Outside the cathedral, many statues, many depictions of historic figures. Canterbury Cathedral, of course, was standing during the English Civil War, so there are a number of figures that were hurt, we could say disfigured, during the Civil War, if their politics was not agreed upon by whatever part of the army was coming through. So for instance, here we have someone who clearly, I do not know who it is, but was not at all popular. And then here is someone on this side who they obviously did not have quite the same quarrel with. As it's part of history, one does not repair, one remembers. This is a picture of what was at that point the newly opened education center at Canterbury, and today it also serves as a lodge where you can go and spend time today. In 2000, it was just built as an education center, and it was being dedicated while I was there for that purpose. Had the chance to go inside and to see and interact with some of the children who were learning about Canterbury and what cathedrals were like. And this was just a charming afternoon to be with these British school children. And here they're looking at a model of what the Canterbury, they call it the Close, because it's a walled area around the cathedral with homes and other buildings built up against it that service the cathedral. So here the children are learning about the Close, that concept. Here's some girls learning about the building blocks and how you make an arch, and they're discovering how the keystone at the top of an arch holds the arch together, and it will all fall apart without having that central keystone. And they take a great deal of fun building it and then pulling it out and then building again and putting it back in, and it's just lovely to be there. Here's some guys, and they're very carefully winching up a large and dangerous looking piece of stone, which is actually made out of styrofoam. Brass rubbings. Often the tombs had depictions on them that could be done in brass rubbings, and sometimes those tombs also had on them large brass covers that also had etchings. I'm thinking of certain cathedrals, particularly in Lincoln Cathedral, that had what they called a sort of a path of gold, which was all of these brass covers in the floor that are now gone because during some lootings they took the brass because it was more valuable, but they left the stone underneath. So you can do a brass rubbing today of the stone. You can do it in gold, and it can just remind you that what was on the stone once upon a time was also done in brass and kept very majestic and regal looking as you just see that corridor of gold stretching out before you. Stained glass, light table, learning about how stained glass is put together. Stone, getting a chance to actually do some chipping of stone. Stone and stained glass, of course, two of the most major building blocks of the cathedral. Here is a knight with the coat of arms, and here are the coat of arms of the various archbishops of Canterbury in the background, and this guy's having great fun with his shield. Canterbury was also an extremely large monastery. One of the reasons it actually survived, as I mentioned, the dissolution of the monasteries was it was a cathedral as well as a monastery, and scholarly learning was a center of monastic life. And here they're learning how to do calligraphy with quill pens and grinding your own ink. A little more stained glass work there. Now we're moving out beyond the walls of the cathedral into Kent, which is the county Canterbury is located in. Stepping across in the back of the cathedral is the original St. Augustine's Abbey, so we're now in the midst of the Abbey ruins, looking to Canterbury from the east. This is the gatehouse to Augustine's Abbey, which has been restored. I'm walking in some of the ruins of that abbey. And this is the grave of St. Augustine. Close to the abbey, St. Martin's, Kent, is the oldest site of Christian worship in the English-speaking world. And this is the main door of St. Martin's. Over its sign is the coat of arms of the archbishops of Canterbury, which contain the palm that we talked about earlier, that's also in the shield as you look up into the Bell Harry Tower. Now, Christianity had been known in Britain among the Celts since the 3rd century, but it was in the 5th century that the southeast was invaded by the pagan Anglo-Saxons who drove the Celts north and west into Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. King Ethelbert received Augustine in 597 when he arrived from Rome, and when he first heard the gospel, he was cautious and unconvinced. However, his fair-mindedness and hospitality were very much evident. And his wife and he were baptized on the following Pentecost, and he became the first Christian king in England. And he helped found missionaries and cathedrals and churches throughout southeastern England, including Canterbury Cathedral. And he was known as a very benevolent monarch who never coerced his people and was very, very fair. That ends our time in Kent. The only way to cross the North Atlantic, no matter the time of year, is on a great ocean liner. And it was a long-time dream of mine to go on the Queen Elizabeth II, and I managed to do that before they retired her. Very privileged to have been on that famous ship. Those of you who know me know I love the history of North Atlantic ocean travel, and I'm going to give you just a little bit of background on the QE2 here in case you're interested. She was built at the John Brown Shipyard on the Clyde Bank. John Brown Shipyard was also famous for building the Mauretania, the Lusitania, the Titanic, the Olympic, the Queen Mary, and the Queen Elizabeth. And on the 5th of July, 1965, the keel was laid for job number 736. And 2 years later, the QE2 was launched by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on September 20th, and she was proclaimed to be the last of the liners. What do I mean last of the liners? Well, there's a very big difference between a liner and a cruise ship. The bow of the liner is very, very pronounced because she's a ship of the line. She has to make it on time, keep a regular schedule no matter where she goes, and that passage can be the roughest or worst seas on the face of the planet at the worst time of year, and she's still got to get there safely and on time. So her bow is very, very sharp, which means that a lot of revenue is lost because on a cruise ship, this bow could be much less, and you can put cabins. Every cabin pays money to the line, to the cruise line or the ocean line company, and the more narrow the bow is, the thicker the hull, the more expensive it is to run, and the less revenue one has. So the shape, the strength, and then also the power of the engines has to be extraordinarily stronger than a cruise ship, because as I said, she can't run from bad weather, she needs to go through it. So all of those things combine to make a very, very expensive construct. And they said that the QE2 would be the last of the liners. In 1982, she was requisitioned for the Falkland War, and she served as a troop transport, and she could hold 3,000 troops on board, and she did make that run. And in 1982, also in June of that year, was retired from active troop service and returned to her liner work. In 2002, she had logged 5 million miles at sea. In 2004, she completed a tandem crossing of the Atlantic with the brand new Queen Mary II. And as of 2008, the QE2 was handed over from Cunard to new owners and is berthed permanently in Dubai and is no longer running. Her gross tonnage was a little over 70,000. Her length, 963 feet, 105-foot beam, 32-foot draft, carried 1,900 passengers, over 1,000 crew, and a total of 2,915 people, souls on board. When I arrived, I found a bottle of champagne in my room with compliments of the Commodore and management of Cunard. Bon voyage. Things are always done first class on Cunard. So I've talked about the last of the liners, and I talked about the Queen Mary II briefly. Cunard was bought by the Carnival Cruise Company, and Carnival decided to actually build another liner. They felt there was a market for this, and so they did. And now, the Queen Mary II is the last and only liner in service. She is over 150,000 tons, more than double the tonnage of the QE2. She's 1,132 feet, that's 170 feet longer than the QE2, and her beam is 135 feet, which is 30 feet wider than the QE2. She can't fit through the Panama Canal, she's so big. Interesting picture of the QE2 here on the left and the Queen Mary II here on the right, and they did that tandem crossing. They did serve together for a few years. Well, I was on the QE2, managed to get to what some of you may recognize as a familiar longitude and latitude, 41.726931 north and 49.948253 west. Of course, we all know what that was. That is the site when on April 15th, 1912, the Titanic went down. QE2 was refitted a number of times. She originally started off as a ship with 3 classes, and she concluded her service as what they call a 1-class ship, which really made it very challenging to get around her, because you could go just about anywhere you wanted to go, but it meant that not all the staircases and elevators would get you there. So there were staircases that would only take you up to a certain deck, then you had to go to another staircase because that was just the class delineation deck for that between second and third class or first and second class. So it was interesting to get around the QE2. A couple of quick pictures of inside the QE2. Here is the original destination lounge, which you would walk into. Notice the low ceilings. If you've been on the Queen Mary 2, ceilings are much, much higher. Much more impressive in many ways, but this is so classic. Here's a sterling silver model of the QE2, which is in the embarkation lounge. The Queen's Ballroom, where tea is served, high tea is served. The Chart Room Lounge, which is a great place to gather before dinner, before going into to the Britannia restaurant, or the Mauritania restaurant, whatever restaurant you've signed up to be in. And here's a picture of my stateroom on deck 22 of the QE2. Please be impressed and know that I could never afford that stateroom. This is actually my real stateroom on deck 3. But I did have a porthole. Which they came and covered on the second day of the trip, unfortunately, with a big brass plate because we were about to hit a hurricane. That was a lot of fun. Tell me about it. If you have want to hear the stories and you haven't, see me afterwards. View from the stern. View of the classic funnel about to go under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which is always that point of drama where they say, can she fit, can she fit? And you know that if she wasn't going to fit, they wouldn't be sailing her there. So she fits, but it's fun to participate in the drama there. And of course, when you're making the crossing from east to west, you are welcomed home by Lady Liberty. And there we are. She doesn't look like she's been through a hurricane, but she has, but they get her all polished up and painted and looking beautiful before she gets into New York to make that impression. And she certainly does make an impression. And so, my friends, there is our final lecture of Holy Lands and Holy Foods. I hope you have enjoyed them as much as I have enjoyed giving them. And I hope you've enjoyed the food as much as all of the people who've worked so hard and wonderfully to put it together. And as a closing prayer, may I again quote Constantine Cavey and translate from that Greek poem Ithaca. May there be many a summer morning when with what pleasure, what joy, you come into harbors seen for the first time.